My name's Eric Gray. I'm from VMware Technical Marketing. And in this session, we're going to talk about some of the aspects of VMware Cloud on AWS that really make it a reliable place for your business applications. You know, it's an age-old problem. IT needs to provide reliable infrastructure so that applications don't go down in case something happens. And the vast amount of things that can happen and can go wrong in a data center, it's amazing. You can have things happen at the individual virtual machine level. They can crash, die. Perhaps the individual virtual disk or storage device that's containing the data can have a problem, so you need to prepare for that. Moving up in the stack a little bit, there could be something wrong with a host. It could be a physical problem with a host. It could be an operating system problem. Racks could go down, top of rack switches can go down. Entire data centers can actually have outages. And in fact, if you're watching the news this week, you'll see that over in France, a major cloud provider had a serious fire in their data center facilities, and that's impacting millions of websites this week. And of course, there's always the regional disaster that you need to plan for when you're responsible for that infrastructure. And even if everything is running okay or great or just the way you want it to, and you're prepared for any disaster that can come your way, you also have other things to plan for, which is making sure you're staying ahead of bugs in the underlying software that you rely on, or watching out for security vulnerabilities so you're not subject to some kind of an attack. And also, you got to prevent yourself from running out of resources, because that's just another problem that can come into your environment that can affect your ability to deliver the infrastructure for those business applications. So today we're going to go through at a pretty broad level, cover all of these aspects, and learn what the VMware Cloud on AWS architecture has to offer to address some of these problems. The other alternative, if you don't want to go with a hosted service like VMware Cloud on AWS, is you can build it yourself. You can do it on-prem, and many of you have probably been doing this for quite a few years, and you're building resiliency and redundancy into that infrastructure. Or maybe in more recent generations of your architectures, you're trying to do it with cloud native applications, where you're building that availability into the application. Of course, that requires rewriting the application to accommodate that. You can't just move existing workloads to the cloud and expect them to have cloud native availability. So there's a lot of benefits going with VMware Cloud on AWS because it's a fully managed service. Just as a recap, a quick summary, this is a jointly engineered service from VMware and AWS. VMware takes care of all of the deployments. We deploy the hypervisor, the SDDC stack on that AWS bare metal infrastructure. VMware takes care of monitoring it, making sure everything's up to date, lifecycle management, patches, upgrades, all that's handled through automated processes. But then if something goes wrong, we also have a staff of expert site reliability engineers that are ready to jump in and address any problems. And that's what you get when you subscribe to VMware Cloud on AWS. It's a fully managed service. So you, as an IT person or as an architect, you don't have to be concerned with the operation of the infrastructure anymore. It's going to be taken care of by the experts. Now let's start to jump into some of the specifics. And we'll start with the smallest thing that can fail, which is probably some storage, a storage device, or maybe some component of storage. So to prevent against that, we need to replicate the storage, have multiple copies of the storage available in the data center in case some portion of that disappears. Now, it'd be great if we could just make a ton of copies of all the data and never have to worry about losing any data. But there's a problem with that. There's always a trade-off whenever you talk about technology and engineering. Storage is it's a finite resource. We can't just have many copies of things, especially if they're not that important to the business. There's some data that can be recreated and doesn't need to be copied 2, 3, 4 times around the data center or to other regions. On the other hand, you have business critical applications. you need them to be available even if there's an outage or even a severe failure in part of the infrastructure. And to deal with this variation in redundancy requirements, we have storage policy-based management, part of vSAN, available to you on VMware Cloud on AWS. Now, by default, we have a managed policy that just takes care of this and uses very good defaults for what you would typically need to do. But if you have to, you can get in there and tune those things and change the ability to tolerate different types and number of failures so you can optimize for your particular use cases. Now, what if we take it up a layer in the stack and we have a problem with a host? You know, a host can fail. Could be a power supply going out or any number of things can happen there. Now, we have a vSAN cluster here. So we have that data replicated like we were just talking about. Great thing we can do with VMware Cloud on AWS is we can just pull a new machine from their vast inventory of physical resources, add it to the cluster. So this is not so easy to do if you're doing it yourself on-prem, but in the cloud, we have that infinite capacity, some call it. We can bring that new host in. We can copy the data that's necessary, all that those redundant copies of data that we've already specified can copy onto that new host. And we bring that host into the cluster, and now we can keep on moving. So we're able to work around the problem with a host failing. Well, what if several hosts were to fail at the same time? We might end up in a situation where we don't have enough copies of the underlying data so that we could recreate it like we just saw. And so for that, we have a solution in VMware Cloud on AWS. We use something called partition placement groups. This is an AWS construct that we take advantage of, and it allows us to make sure that only one host from a cluster will be placed in a particular rack. This allows us to protect against rack outages, top of rack switch failures, things like that. So only one host would be impacted if a problem occurred in a rack. Now, if you have multiple clusters, you may end up with a host from each cluster in one rack. So if there was a rack failure, you might have multiple hosts affected in that scenario, but not if they're in the same cluster. So this allows us to really protect the integrity and make sure we always have a majority for that vSAN cluster. And this support goes all the way up to the max supported size of a cluster on VMware Cloud on AWS, which is currently 16. Now, going a little bit beyond the rack, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right now there's a really critical problem going on in France with an entire data center has caught on fire from a big cloud provider over there, not AWS. And if all of your workloads, even if you had 10 redundant copies of your data, but they're all in the same data center, and that data center is shut down due to something like a fire or a disaster, it's gone. So in order to work around that, AWS has a best practice just in general, as most people know, is they always recommend deploying your applications into multiple availability zones. This way you can survive any kind of outages that might occur in one of the AZs. So VMware Cloud on AWS offers the ability to set up a stretched cluster. This allows you to put half of your hosts in each availability zone, plus 2 availability zones. It's treated like a single cluster, but your workloads can run in either side. And if there's a failure, we can restart the workloads on the surviving availability zone. Now, in case you've never seen what it looks like, I wanted to just give you a really quick glimpse at the interface. What we're looking at here is the vSphere client. If you've used vSphere, I'm sure most of you have over the years, it's the same thing when you use VMware Cloud on AWS, and that's one of the great things about the service is it's that transferable skills right to the cloud. Well, let's take a look at what we have here. We can see we have a cluster. It has 6 hosts in it. 3 of the hosts are in this network, 3 are in the other network. And over on the summary pane here for this particular host, you can see that it shows which fault domain it's in. So this is actually an availability zone on AWS, so US West 2. Now, if we take a look at one of these other hosts, you can see it's in a different fault domain, US West 2B. And so that's just what you would see if you were to deploy a stretched cluster onto the service. You'd see a single cluster, but the hosts are in two different locations. And they act as one entity, but two fault domains. And then if we drill down to an individual VM, just to give you an idea of that data redundancy that we were talking about at the beginning, you can see we have RAID 1 redundancy here. And so in one fault domain, we have two copies. So we have a copy on each host, two hosts. And then in the other fault domain, we also have two copies. So we have four copies of that data. That allows us to survive a host failure as well as an entire AZ outage without losing any data for that particular workload. And we have VMware Cloud on AWS in most of the regions worldwide where Amazon has data centers, not all, but so here's a current list, and we're adding more as customers demand. But I want to point out one thing. There are a few regions where we don't offer the stretched clusters because in those regions, there are only two availability zones. And even though I only talked about two availability zones a second ago, you actually need three AZs in total to have a reliable cluster like that. Because, if you just have and it gets split right down the middle, a split brain condition, something like that, you're going to have a problem knowing which side is the master. You'll lose quorum. And so for that reason, we have a witness in the third availability zone. So we've got the primary, the secondary, and that witness with just a small thing running there. So that's why in some regions, we cannot have a stretched cluster. So what if you're in a region and the worst happens? There's some kind of a disaster, and you really need to be able to operate your workloads somewhere else. For that, we also have a disaster recovery as a service, and this is called VMware Site Recovery, VSR. This is based on the tried and proven Site Recovery Manager technology, and you can use Site Recovery. You can use it from on-prem to the cloud, for sure, but you can also use it from one site to another site. And this allows you to replicate all of your critical workloads to a completely different region. And this is a solution that's really designed to support business critical applications, very low RPO and RTO. Now, I'll just mention one other disaster recovery service. I'm not going to go into any other details there, but we have a newer one called VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, VCDR. And this is a SaaS service that you can use to protect your on-prem data center to the cloud currently. That's the use case for that. And it's really optimized to take advantage of the economy of low-cost cloud storage. So there's just a couple different use cases there for disaster recovery. But the important thing to remember there is we have the ability to help you through proven services to protect your data to another region to guard against those disasters. And then going along with disaster recovery, data protection, to guard against just data corruption, human errors, or, ransomware, anything like that, where you need a backup copy of your data. Of course, it's proven. We've been doing it for decades. We need to back up our workloads. Replication and all that is not enough. And so the great thing about being in VMware Cloud on AWS is you have a high-speed connection to AWS infrastructure, where most of the leading backup vendors have some kind of a cloud service that you can deploy there. So that may be in the form of an EC2 instance. That would be your backup target. Or in some cases, there are backup software that can back up to an S3 bucket directly. But regardless, you're going to be able to take advantage of this high-speed Elastic network interface. And that will actually reduce the charges because you won't be, Amazon won't charge you for backing up within the same region. So you can cut down, you'll have great bandwidth and also lower cost and keep that data backed up just like you would on-prem. And in many cases, you can use the same exact technology that you would use in your on-prem data center that you've trusted for many years. They probably have a cloud-based solution for that as well. Now, all of that is great, and we've got all those failures accounted for, but what about the networking? If the underlying networking has any problems, it doesn't matter if the applications are running because nobody can get to them. And so we've definitely invested heavily in creating a resilient network infrastructure for VMware Cloud on AWS. Because we're in the AWS data centers running on their bare metal infrastructure, we can take advantage of their proven AWS networking for an underlay. And then we will deploy NSXT as the network virtualization layer on top of that. So not to go into great detail on NSXT, but it makes it very easy for you to create new network segments for your workloads, establish VPN back to your other data centers, and also protect your workloads through firewalls and also micro-segmentation. So there are a lot of great things you get from NSXT. It's part of VMware Cloud on AWS. You do not have to deploy anything. It is part of the solution. It's ready to use as soon as you spin up your first software-defined data center. NSXT has this concept of an edge router, which is a virtual machine with some logical routers inside it. So they call them tiers 0 and tier 1. Not too critical right now to understand what those are, but the important thing is we do have an active standby set of those edge routers. They're connected using the Elastic network interface for very good bandwidth and performance to the internet and to the transit connect to back to your on-prem. All these things can take advantage of that bandwidth there. And if there's a failure, the standby edge will take over. It's running on another host and it's ready to go. And in many cases, even the failover, I should say, the connection to your services from the outside will be failed over to that standby because we do synchronize the session state for the traffic that's flowing through that firewall. So we can survive a host failure by failing over the edge router very easily. In many cases, no one will even notice that it happened. Let me just show you an example of what that looks like. In the environment, there's a compute resource pool. That's what we looked at a second ago. There's also a management resource pool that is set aside, dedicated for these management virtual machines like vCenter and then these NSX components. And then you can see on the screen here, we do have 2 edges and they are deployed onto different hosts. And then there's also the NSX manager. There's 3 of them and they're also deployed across multiple hosts for redundancy. So we're really preparing for any sort of failure that might occur with that infrastructure. Now let's say everything's running great and your business is wildly successful. Now there might be another problem. You might run out of capacity. So if you're building your own infrastructure, you need to plan for that. You need to have some additional resources, hardware, servers ready to go, perhaps racked up and installed, ready to supplement the clusters that are supporting your business applications. With VMware Cloud on AWS, we can avoid the starvation that can affect your service level by taking advantage of something called Elastic DRs. I'm sure everybody's heard of DRs before. It's been around for many, many versions of vSphere, but this is a different take on that. Elastic DRs allows us to add hosts to a cluster automatically so that you'll have those resources available so they can continue to support the increased demand that your application might be receiving. And so the key resource that we definitely care about is storage. We don't want to run out of storage and start to lose data. So if the storage threshold is crossed, we're definitely going to add another host. And then there's some other parameters we can tune as far as CPU and memory. We can also downsize the cluster, right size it. So there's no sense paying for capacity that you're not using, especially in a cloud service like this. So once all of those go down below a certain threshold, we can actually take a host out of the cluster in an orderly fashion. Put it in maintenance mode, get all the virtual machines off of there, shut it down, take it out of the cluster, and then you'll no longer be paying for that host because the service is charged based on the number of hosts that are running by the hour. Different ways to configure Elastic DRs. By default, we really just focus on the storage. If you're running out of storage, we're going to add more hosts for you automatically. But if you are in a business where you really need to make sure your applications are not being starved for CPU or memory, then you can choose one of these other policies, and you can even optimize it for rapid scale out. So if you want to be able to quickly add several hosts because you're expecting a demand. Maybe it's something you know about monthly or annually. You know that when the demand comes, you need to be able to add several hosts, maybe up until the maximum right away. So we can do that. Or if you have a test and dev environment, yeah, okay, you might want to add some resources so your developers aren't screaming that their apps won't run, but perhaps you don't want to spend as much money as you would for your production machine. So we've got some knobs you can use to tune that policy there.
Hey, so Eric, I want to ask a quick question, if I may. When you were talking about being able to scale out automatically through Elastic DRs and scale back in, which parts of those are automatic and which parts are like recommendations that are being made that require manual intervention by the customer?
No, it's automatic as long as they drop, as long as all of the resources drop below a set threshold, we will remove a host.
Okay, I thought that used to be manual, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and then of course there's some guards in there to prevent it from churning. Let's say you had some application that was suddenly spiking for an hour and then down. I mean, it's not going to add and remove hosts multiple times an hour. There's going to be some checks in there, but it is an automated capability. And then you have these knobs to tune that.
Understood. And we had a question actually come in from the audience that we missed earlier. I want to just kind of walk back a bit. When we were talking about stretched clusters, one of the viewers of the live stream wanted to know about what kind of egress charges customers would expect when stretched clusters have to replicate across availability zones.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. This is actually something that is new. We just announced that we now include 10 terabytes of traffic between availability zones as part of that replication. And so that should cover, most scenarios. But beyond that, there will be some charges.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. That was really all I had, just as a summary of the things that are built in to the VMware Cloud on AWS service that you can take advantage of as an architect, working with your own customers, working with your enterprise. These are things you no longer have to worry about building into the infrastructure because they're part of the service. Now you can focus on the applications and talk to your business about, what do they need from you, not just infrastructure management. We've got the failure protection across the board from all the way from the individual storage devices to the host, to the racks, to the clusters, data centers, even regions. We have solutions to protect your data there. VMware is keeping track of vulnerabilities that might affect the environment. They're putting out fully tested patch releases, upgrading those environments in a timely fashion. You don't have to do it. We've got the reliable networking based on NSXT. All of that is available to you as a part of the service. And then a couple items I wanted to throw out there. On the right, you see that we have this white paper covering all these resiliency and availability benefits that I just mentioned. Short URL on the screen there if you want to type it in. This just really goes into more detail about all the things I talked about today. And on the left-hand side, you can see we've got a new infographic This is a draft. I expect to have the final out very soon. This is something maybe you could use if you're a partner and you want to talk to your customers about VMware Cloud on AWS and they have concerns about availability or resiliency. You could just sit down with them and go through this and explain all of these points that I was just talking about today. That's just something you can look forward to. You'll be able to find that on all the usual social channels and things like that very soon when it comes out. And that's it. And I'll take any other questions that you might have. We're almost out of time. We've got a couple minutes left.
Hey, Eric, we did have one other question from one of the viewers. They were curious if there's an SLA around how long it takes to add a host to DRS. Does it take 15 minutes, an hour? Is there any kind of guarantee on how quickly that host can be added?
Okay, so is there an SLA on adding a host? Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
Okay.
It takes a couple hours to deploy the entire SDDC. So you should expect to be significantly less to deploy an individual host. But as far as the SLA and whether or not that's covered in the SLA, you'd have to review the SLA that you have with VMware, I think.
Okay.
I don't think there's any official SLA on that specific add host function. I think it generally takes 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'd heard 12 minutes, but
yeah,
it's in there. Yep.
Yeah, ballpark 10. Let's just say 10 to 15.
Yeah.
But again, there's no specific SLA to my knowledge. But Eric's right; like it's all covered in our terms of service if it is there.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question about some of the use cases that you were actually talking about. And you talked about ENI and some buckets on the other side. I was actually thinking that there are some very elaborate use cases that you could have actually talked about, things like reference architectures, horizon deployments. There's load balancers being integrated into your VMware infrastructure. So are there any specific use cases that you as VMware work with which actually integrate directly into the native environment that customers are aspiring to integrate into it in due course?
Okay, so I'm not 100% sure I'm following the question. Yes, we do have a vast number of integrations with cloud native applications with AWS services that are possible through that connection through what we call the connected VPC. And yeah, we couldn't get into all those details today. So I'm not sure the best way to answer that question other than, we're investing so much in this service to deliver all of the capabilities that our customers are asking for. And yeah, you're right. There's so many other things we could have talked about today. True.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'm not 100%, kind of like Eric, not 100% sure exactly what you're asking, but if you're talking about integration between VMware Cloud and AWS and like the native AWS services or even just core functionalities, I mean, there's a lot of basic ones, right? Like things like transit gateway and VPNs and be able to manage those and expose AWS native services into your SCDC environment, integration with things like CloudFormation to be able to automate provisioning, working on supporting IAM policies, which I believe we have a few today, but we're working on expanding. So some of those really common things that you see AWS users using, we're trying to integrate into those so it becomes just a seamless extension, that they have a certain way of doing things with apps on AWS, that we can enable a lot of those same workflows and capabilities within VMware Cloud on AWS.